The Emperor's dragon drove away all trainers, but one veteran father changed everything. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the Imperial Dragon Corps facility as another trainer hit the reinforced wall. General Wrath watched from behind protective barriers as medics rushed to help the unconscious Altran specialist. That made 17 failed attempts in 8 months. The creature responsible for this latest casualty prowled behind energy shields that hummed with dangerous power. Tempest was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. The dragon's midnight scales reflected the emergency lighting like liquid metal, while bioluminescent patterns pulsed along its flanks in warning colors. Standing 12 feet tall at the shoulder and stretching nearly 40 feet from nose to tail, the beast possessed intelligence that burned in eyes the color of molten gold. Those eyes had once looked upon its trainer with loyalty and affection. Now they held only pain and rage. Emperor Valak stood in the observation deck above, his decorated uniform crisp despite the late hour. The ruler of the Altarian Empire rarely left his palace world. But Tempest represented more than just a weapon. The dragon was the last of its genetically perfected bloodline, bred over centuries to bond with a single trainer and capable of destroying entire enemy fleets. More importantly, it was a symbol of imperial might that the galaxy respected and feared. "Your Majesty," General Wrath said carefully, "perhaps we should consider other options. The creature shows no signs of accepting a new bond. My advisors believe termination might be the safest course." The Emperor's expression darkened. "Termination? Do you understand what you're suggesting, General? This dragon cost more than a battle fleet to develop. Its genetic material represents 300 years of bioengineering mastery. And you want me to destroy it because your trainers lack skill?" Wrath swallowed hard. "The beast killed Trainer Voss, Your Majesty. It hospitalized 11 others. Our best dragon masters refuse to attempt bonding now. Even the Mendari psychic binders have declared it impossible." Below them, Tempest unleashed a roar that shook the facility's foundations. The dragon's grief was obvious to anyone who looked closely. It had lost more than a trainer when Commander Yates died in the Battle of Kepler's Edge. It had lost its purpose, its companion, and its sense of safety. The subsequent parade of would-be replacements only reminded the creature of what it had lost, while treating it like a prize. To be won rather than a being to be understood. The Emperor studied the dragon with calculating eyes. What about unconventional candidates? Surely someone in this vast empire has the ability to reach this creature. "We've tried everything, Your Majesty. Military trainers, civilian animal specialists, even some of the outer world beastmasters. The dragon rejects them all." "Then look beyond the empire," Valak commanded. "Send recruiters to every system, every species, every world that might produce someone capable of this task. Offer whatever price necessary. I will not lose this dragon to incompetence." 3 months later, and halfway across the galaxy, David Miller wiped sweat from his forehead as he finished his shift in the lithium mines of New Haven. The frontier world offered little comfort, but it provided steady work for those willing to dig deep and ask few questions. David had come here after his military discharge, seeking a place where he and his daughter Lucy could start over, after losing his wife Sarah to the Centauri plague. The mining town of Prospect sat in a valley surrounded by red rock, formations that reminded David of Earth's old American Southwest. Most colonists worked the mines or supported those who did, creating a tight community of families just trying to make honest livings far from the empire's grand politics. David's modest home sat on the settlement's edge, where Lucy tended a small garden that provided fresh vegetables to supplement their rations. She was 16 now, growing into a young woman who possessed her mother's gentle spirit and her father's stubborn determination. The loss of Sarah had hit them both hard, but they'd learned to lean on each other through the worst of their grief. "Dad, there are some official-looking people asking about you at Morrison's store," Lucy said as David entered their kitchen. She looked worried, which immediately put him on alert. Official visits rarely brought good news to former soldiers trying to live quietly. David cleaned up quickly and walked into town, where he found 2 figures in imperial uniforms waiting outside the general store. One was human, a woman with the bearing of a career military officer. Her companion was Velteran, a species known for their diplomatic skills and ability to read emotional states. "Sergeant David Miller?" the woman asked. "I'm Colonel Hayes from Imperial Recruitment Division. This is Ambassador Krell. We'd like to speak with you about an opportunity." David kept his expression neutral. I'm a civilian now, Colonel. Been out of the service for 3 years. We're aware of your discharge status, Ambassador Krell said in the melodious voice typical of his species. We're not here for military recruitment. This concerns a specialized position requiring your particular background. They explained the situation in broad terms. The Empire needed someone capable of working with a traumatized military animal. David's service record showed experience with enhanced warhounds during the Centauri campaigns, along with commendations for his ability to work with both wounded soldiers and animals under extreme stress. Why me? David asked. There must be thousands of trainers with better qualifications. Colonel Hayes exchanged glances with her companion. Conventional qualifications aren't working. We need someone who understands trauma and recovery. Your psychological profile suggests you might approach this differently than traditional trainers. David thought of Lucy, of their quiet life on New Haven, of the bills that never seemed to get smaller despite his steady work. The Empire was offering enough money to secure Lucy's education and their future. But more than that, something in their description of the traumatized creature resonated with his own experience of loss and healing. I'll need to bring my daughter, David said finally. She's all the family I have left. That can be arranged, Ambassador Krell assured him. The facility has quarters for families. As they finalized arrangements for departure, David wondered what he was getting into. He'd spent years learning to help Lucy cope with losing her mother, drawing on patience and understanding rather than force or demands. Perhaps those same skills might reach a creature that others had failed to help. 3 days later, David and Lucy boarded an Imperial transport bound for the Dragon Core facility. As New Haven's red rocks disappeared below them, David hoped he was making the right choice. He had no idea he was about to challenge everything the galaxy thought it knew about strength, power, and the bonds that could exist between different species. Lucy pressed her face against the transport's viewport as the Dragon Core facility came into view. The massive structure hung in orbit around Altaria Prime like a mechanical moon, its gleaming surfaces reflecting the light of twin suns. David watched his daughter's excitement and felt a knot of worry in his stomach. He'd brought her into the heart of the Empire based on little more than hope and desperation. It's incredible, Dad, Lucy whispered. Look how huge it is. The facility stretched for miles in every direction, a city-sized complex devoted to housing and training the Empire's most dangerous biological weapons. Docking bays large enough for battleships punctuated its hull, while observation towers provided panoramic views of the planet below. David had expected something military and functional. This looked more like a palace built for giants. General Wrath met them at the docking bay personally, his weathered face bearing the scars of someone who'd worked with dangerous creatures for decades. The man moved with careful precision, never making sudden gestures or loud noises. David recognized the behavior from his own experience with war animals. Sergeant Miller, welcome aboard, Wrath said, extending his hand. I hope you understand the magnitude of what we're asking. This creature has defied our best efforts for months. David shook the offered hand. Colonel Hayes mentioned trauma. What exactly happened to cause this? Wrath's expression darkened as they walked through corridors lined with viewing windows. Behind the reinforced glass, David caught glimpses of other dragons in various stages of training. These creatures were smaller than he'd expected, roughly the size of old Earth elephants, with handlers working them through complex maneuvers. Commander Yates was Tempest's trainer for 8 years, Wrath explained. They bonded when the dragon was barely larger than a house cat. Yates raised it, trained it, fought beside it in 17 major engagements. They were inseparable. They stopped at an elevator that required special authorization to access. As it descended toward the facility's lower levels, Wrath continued his explanation. The Battle of Kepler's Edge was supposed to be routine. Intelligence indicated light resistance, minimal anti-aircraft defenses. But the rebels had prepared an ambush. Yates and Tempest were caught in a plasma bombardment that destroyed half our assault force. David listened carefully, noting the pain in the general's voice. Whatever had happened at Kepler's Edge had affected more than just the dragon. Yates died shielding Tempest from a direct hit. The dragon was injured but survived. By the time our rescue teams reached them, Tempest was changed. It wouldn't leave Yates's body for 3 days. When we finally managed to sedate it and bring them back, the creature went catatonic for weeks. The elevator stopped at a level marked special containment. The corridors here were wider, reinforced with materials David didn't recognize. Emergency lighting cast everything in red shadows, and the air carried a scent like ozone and wild animals. When Tempest finally became active again, it was violent toward anyone who approached. We thought it would settle given time, but every attempt to establish a new bond has failed. The dragon seems to view any potential trainer as either a threat or an inadequate replacement for Yates. They reached a final checkpoint where armed guards verified their identities before allowing access to the observation deck. David stepped forward and got his first look at Tempest. Nothing could have prepared him for the reality of the creature. The dragon was enormous, far larger than the others he'd seen. Its body filled most of the vast containment chamber, a living mountain of muscle and scales that seemed to absorb the facility's lighting. Bioluminescent patterns traced along its flanks like flowing circuits, pulsing with colors David had no names for. But it was the dragon's eyes that struck him most powerfully. They burned with intelligence and anguish, the gaze of a being that had lost everything that mattered. David had seen that look before, in mirror reflections during the worst days after Sarah's death. "My God," Lucy breathed beside him. "It's beautiful." Tempest's head swung toward their voices, those golden eyes focusing on the new arrivals with predatory intensity. For a moment, David felt the weight of that ancient intelligence studying him, measuring him, judging him, wanting. 17 trainers have attempted bonding, Wrath said quietly. The Mindari psychics lasted longest, almost 6 hours before Tempest's mental defenses drove them away. Most attempts end in violence within minutes. David watched the dragon move restlessly around its enclosure, noting the careful way it avoided certain areas. What's in those spaces it won't go near? Wrath checked his tablet. Remains of training equipment from previous attempts. Perches, feeding stations, bonding pedestals. Anything associated with the training process seems to trigger aggressive responses. Has anyone tried just being present? Not training, not bonding, just existing in the same space? The general looked puzzled. Existing? What would be the purpose of that? David studied Tempest's movements more carefully, seeing patterns others had missed. The dragon's restlessness wasn't random. It followed routes that would have made sense if Yates were still present, pausing at spots where its trainer might have stood or worked. This was a creature maintaining routines for someone who would never return. Sometimes healing takes time, David said finally. Sometimes you have to acknowledge the loss before you can move forward. General Wrath frowned. The Emperor wants results, Sergeant. We can't afford extended delays. With respect, General, you've been trying the same approach for 8 months. Maybe it's time to consider that this dragon doesn't need a new trainer. Maybe it needs to grieve properly first. Lucy moved closer to the viewing window, her reflection superimposed over the massive creature beyond. Dad, it looks so lonely. Tempest had stopped moving and was staring directly at Lucy with an expression David couldn't quite read. For just a moment, the dragon's bioluminescent patterns shifted to softer blues and greens, colors that seemed less threatening than its usual warning displays. I'd like to start tomorrow, David told Wrath. But I'm going to do this my way, at my pace. No rushing, no forcing, no demanding immediate results. The general looked skeptical but nodded agreement. As they prepared to leave for their quarters, David took one last look at Tempest. The dragon was still watching Lucy, its great head tilted as if trying to understand something about these new humans that was different from all the others. That night in their temporary quarters, Lucy asked the question David had been dreading. Dad, what if you can't help it either? What happens to the dragon then? David looked out their window at the stars beyond, thinking of all the times he'd felt just as lost and alone as Tempest appeared to be. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, sweetheart. But I have a feeling this dragon and I might understand each other better than anyone expects. David's first morning at the facility began with protests from nearly everyone involved. Dr. Chen, the chief dragon specialist, stood with her arms crossed as David examined the standard training equipment laid out in the preparation chamber. This is completely irregular, she said for the third time. Every successful bonding in Imperial history has followed established protocols. Dominance displays, psychic assertion, controlled environmental manipulation. You can't just ignore centuries of proven methods. David picked up a neural control crown, studying its intricate design. The device was beautiful in its complexity, incorporating technology from dozens of species to create a tool for mental bonding. He set it aside gently. I'm not ignoring your methods, Doctor. I'm suggesting they might not be appropriate for this particular situation. General Wrath entered the chamber carrying a tablet full of schedules and requirements. The Emperor expects daily progress reports, Sergeant. What exactly am I supposed to tell him when you refuse to use any actual training techniques? Tell him I'm conducting an assessment phase, David replied calmly. Every good trainer studies their subject before attempting contact. What David didn't mention was that his real plan would sound insane to these people. He intended to sit with Tempest, to simply exist in the dragon's presence without demanding anything in return. He'd learned this approach with Lucy during the worst of her grief, when she'd needed someone to just be there rather than trying to fix everything. The observation deck above Tempest's enclosure had been modified with safety barriers and emergency exits, standard precautions for trainer sessions. David ignored all of it, settling into a simple chair he'd requested from quarters. He brought a thermos of coffee, Lucy's latest letter from her new tutors, and a book of poetry Sarah had loved. Tempest noticed his presence immediately. The dragon's massive head swung toward the observation area, golden eyes locking onto this new human who sat so calmly near its domain. David felt the weight of that ancient intelligence studying him, but he didn't respond with dominance displays or bonding attempts. Instead, he opened Lucy's letter and began reading. Dad, the tutors here are amazing. Master Webb is teaching me xenobiology, and I'm learning about 17 different species so far. Did you know that Velteran children don't develop emotional regulation until they're 25? That explains a lot about Ambassador Krell. David smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm, completely ignoring the fact that a creature capable of destroying starships was studying his every move. This behavior puzzled Tempest, who had grown accustomed to humans approaching with fear, aggression, or calculated confidence. This one seemed genuinely uninterested in asserting any form of dominance. Hours passed. David finished the letter, sipped his coffee, and opened Sarah's poetry book. Occasionally, he'd read a passage aloud, not to the dragon, but simply because he enjoyed the sound of the words. Tempest's bioluminescent patterns gradually shifted from warning reds and oranges to curious blues and purples. This is unprecedented, Dr. Chen whispered to General Wrath in the monitoring booth above. Look at the dragon's stress indicators. They're dropping to levels we haven't seen since before Commander Yates died. David spent the entire first day simply being present. He left only for meals and brief breaks, always returning to the same chair with the same calm demeanor. Tempest began to anticipate his arrival, positioning itself where it could observe this strange human who made no demands. The second day brought concerned questions from facility staff. David's behavior violated every principle of dragon training they understood. He wasn't establishing dominance, wasn't attempting mental contact, wasn't even acknowledging the creature as a potential partner, yet Tempest showed more stability than it had in months. I don't understand what you're accomplishing, General Wrath said during David's lunch break. The dragon is calmer, yes, but there's no progress toward bonding. David set down his sandwich and considered his words carefully. General, when my wife died, people kept trying to help Lucy and me move on and find closure. They meant well, but what we really needed was time to process what we'd lost. This dragon hasn't been allowed to grieve properly. Grieve? It's an animal, Sergeant. Is it? David asked quietly. Because from where I sit, it's a highly intelligent being that formed a deep emotional bond with someone who died protecting it. That sounds pretty familiar to me. On the third day, David made his first attempt at communication, not through neural interfaces or psychic bonding, but through simple speech. As he settled into his chair, he began talking to Tempest as if the dragon were Lucy. My daughter would love to meet you, he said conversationally. She's fascinated by xenobiology, keeps asking questions about how different species form emotional connections. He paused to sip his coffee. I told her about losing people you care about, how it feels like part of yourself dies with them. Tempest's head tilted slightly, the first time the dragon had shown direct interest in David's presence. Yates must have been special, David continued. 8 years is a long time to spend with someone. You probably knew his moods better than he did, could sense what he needed before he asked. The dragon's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with softer colors. Losing someone like that, it changes everything. Makes the world feel wrong somehow. For the first time since David had begun his vigil, Tempest moved closer to the observation area. The massive creature approached slowly, carefully, until it was near enough that David could see individual scales and the complex patterns of its luminescent displays. "I know you miss him," David said gently. "I miss my wife every single day, but I learned something important from my daughter. Grief isn't something you get over. It's something you learn to carry differently." Tempest settled onto the floor of its enclosure, bringing its great head level with David's position. Those golden eyes held a depth of sadness that resonated with David's own experience of loss. "The people here want to replace Yates," David continued, "but I don't think that's what you need. I think you need someone who understands that he can't be replaced, that what you had with him was special and unique and worth honoring." The dragon's eyes never left David's face as he spoke. Something passed between them in that moment. Not the forced mental connection that other trainers had attempted, but a recognition of shared experience. By the end of the third day, Tempest had begun responding to David's voice with subtle changes in posture and coloration. Still no aggression, no attempts to drive him away, just careful attention and what almost looked like hope. Dr. Chen was baffled by the readings she was getting. "The dragon's neural patterns are stabilizing in ways I've never seen. It's as if it's processing traumatic memories instead of suppressing them." David packed up his things as evening approached, preparing to return to quarters and another worried conversation with Lucy via communication system. As he stood to leave, Tempest made a sound he hadn't heard before. Not a roar or growl, but something almost questioning. "I'll be back tomorrow," David promised the dragon. "Same time, same chair. We have more talking to do." For the first time in 8 months, Tempest settled into what looked like peaceful rest as David walked away. The facility's night shift reported that the dragon slept deeply, without the restless movements and stress responses that had characterized its behavior since Yates's death. Progress, David thought as he headed home to his daughter. Not the kind anyone expected, but progress nonetheless. 2 weeks into David's unconventional approach, Lucy convinced the facility administrators to let her visit the observation deck. She'd been asking daily about her father's progress, and her tutors reported that she spent most of her free time researching dragon behavior and interspecies bonding. "Remember what we discussed," David told her as they walked through the security checkpoints. "Tempest is still healing. No sudden movements, no loud noises. Just be yourself." Lucy nodded seriously. At 16, she possessed a maturity beyond her years, shaped by loss and responsibility. She'd been David's anchor during their darkest days, and he trusted her judgment completely. Tempest noticed Lucy's presence immediately. The dragon's great head lifted from its resting position, golden eyes focusing on the young human with unmistakable curiosity. David had been talking about his daughter for days, and now the creature could finally see this person who seemed so important to the strange trainer, who asked for nothing. "Hello, Tempest," Lucy said softly, settling into a chair beside her father. "Dad's told me so much about you." The dragon's bioluminescent patterns shifted to the soft blue-green colors David had learned to associate with calm interest. Tempest moved closer to their viewing area, massive form flowing with surprising grace across the enclosure floor. "She's beautiful," Lucy whispered to David. "And so sad. I can see it in her eyes." David felt a moment of pride in his daughter's perception. She'd identified something that trained specialists had missed. "What else do you notice?" Lucy studied Tempest carefully, her young mind processing details with the fresh perspective of someone unencumbered by preconceptions. "She keeps looking at that corner over there. The empty one with no equipment." David followed Lucy's gaze to an area of the enclosure that Tempest visited regularly, but never lingered in. "What do you think that means?" "Maybe that's where Commander Yates used to stand," Lucy suggested. "When I visit Mom's grave, I always sit in the same spot where we used to watch sunsets together." The insight hit David like a revelation. Tempest wasn't avoiding reminders of Yates. It was maintaining connections to its lost partner. The dragon had created a memorial space, a place where it could remember without the interference of well-meaning humans trying to force new relationships. "Lucy, I think you just solved something important," David said quietly. Over the following days, David began incorporating Lucy's observations into his approach. Instead of treating Tempest's attachment to Yates as something to overcome, he acknowledged it as something to honor. He asked General Wrath about Commander Yates's personal effects, his habits, his relationship with the dragon. Yates always carried field rations in his left pocket, Dr. Chen recalled during one of their briefing sessions. Emergency food bars that Tempest particularly enjoyed. He'd share them during training breaks. Did he have any personal items that might still carry his scent? David asked. General Rath looked uncomfortable. We cleaned out his quarters months ago. Standard procedure after casualties. But there might be something in storage. They found a jacket in the facility's personal effects warehouse, a worn flight suit that still smelled faintly of its former owner. David approached the storage request carefully, explaining that he wanted to help Tempest process its grief rather than forcing it to forget. The breakthrough came during David's third week of patient attendance. He'd brought Commander Yates's jacket with him, not to wave it around or use it as a training tool, but simply to have it present. When Tempest caught the familiar scent, the dragon's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The massive creature approached the barrier between them with desperate hope. Pressing against the energy field as close as physics would allow, its bioluminescent patterns blazed with colors David had never seen before, complex emotions playing across its scales like a living light show. I know, David said gently. I know you miss him. Tempest began making sounds David had never heard from the dragon before. Not roars or growls, but something almost like vocalizations. The creature was trying to communicate, to share something that went beyond simple animal responses. What is it, girl? David asked, rising from his chair for the first time in weeks. What are you trying to tell me? The dragon's eyes fixed on David with burning intensity. And suddenly he felt something brush against his consciousness. Not the forced mental intrusion that previous trainers had attempted, but something gentle and questioning, like a hesitant knock on a door. David had experienced psychic contact before, during his military service with enhanced animals. But this was different. Tempest wasn't trying to dominate or submit. The dragon was asking permission to share something precious and painful. Okay, David whispered, lowering his mental defenses with the same care he might use approaching a wounded animal. Show me. The contact was brief but overwhelming. David experienced flashes of memory and emotion that weren't his own. He saw Yates as Tempest had known him, not just as a trainer or commanding officer, but as a friend, a partner, a source of comfort during long missions far from home. He felt the dragon's confusion when Yates had pushed it away during the final battle, a desperate attempt to save his partner's life. He experienced Tempest's guilt at surviving when Yates had not. When the connection faded, David found himself wiping away tears he hadn't realized were falling. Tempest was watching him with an expression he could only describe as hopeful. You wanted me to understand, David said, his voice rough with emotion. You needed someone to know what he meant to you. The dragon's response was a low, harmonious sound that seemed to acknowledge David's comprehension. For the first time since arriving at the facility, Tempest looked truly at peace. Word of the breakthrough spread quickly through the facility. Emperor Valix himself arrived within days to witness the impossible, his war dragon responding positively to a human trainer. But as the Imperial entourage gathered in the observation area, David sensed their expectations like pressure in the air. Sergeant Miller, the Emperor said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. I'm told you've made contact with the creature. When will it be ready for deployment? David felt Tempest tense beside him, the dragon's patterns shifting toward warning colors at the mention of military service. The creature had just begun to heal from trauma caused by combat. The idea of immediately returning to battle felt like a betrayal of everything they'd accomplished. Your Majesty, David said carefully, Tempest has made remarkable progress in processing grief and trauma, but rushing back into combat service could undo all of that healing. Emperor Valix's expression hardened. This dragon represents an investment of billions of credits and decades of development. It was created to serve the Empire, not to indulge in emotional recovery. David looked at Tempest, seeing intelligence and trust in those golden eyes, remembering the memories the dragon had shared with him. He thought of Lucy, of the lessons he'd taught her about standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. With respect, Your Majesty, David said quietly. Tempest isn't just a weapon. She's a living being capable of complex emotions and deep loyalty. She deserves better than to be treated as disposable military equipment. The silence that followed David's words was deafening. Nobody spoke to Emperor Valix that way, and expected to remain breathing. But before the ruler could respond, Tempest moved. The dragon positioned itself between David and the Imperial Party, not aggressively but protectively. Its message was clear: harm this human, and face consequences that no prison could contain. Emperor Valix stared at the massive creature, his expression unreadable, while David waited to learn whether his compassion would cost him everything. Emperor Valix studied the protective stance of his war dragon with calculating eyes. Around him, his advisors shifted nervously, uncertain how to react to a situation that violated every protocol they knew. Nobody had ever seen Tempest show protective instincts toward a trainer, and certainly nobody had expected a lowly sergeant to challenge Imperial authority so directly. "Fascinating," the Emperor said finally, his tone giving nothing away. "The creature bonds with someone who shows it kindness rather than strength. Perhaps there's more to learn from this unconventional approach." David felt Tempest relax slightly, though the dragon remained between him and the Imperial Party. He'd bought them time, but he suspected it wouldn't last long. The Empire had pressing military concerns, and war dragons weren't raised as pets. The situation became critical 3 days later when Admiral Stone arrived with urgent deployment orders. The outer colonies had launched a coordinated rebellion, capturing several key systems and threatening vital shipping routes. Intelligence suggested the rebels were massing for an attack on Alteria's primary military shipyards. "The Dragon deploys with the 3rd Battle Group tomorrow," Stone announced during the emergency briefing. "Target is the rebel base on Meridian 7. Intelligence indicates civilian populations, but they're supporting insurgent activities." David felt his stomach drop. Meridian 7 wasn't just a rebel stronghold. It was home to 3 million colonists, including families and children, who'd had no choice in their world's political alignment. "Admiral, what about civilian casualties?" "Acceptable losses," Stone replied curtly. "The Dragon's presence will shorten the engagement and reduce overall casualties. Terror weapons serve their purpose when used decisively." That evening, David sat in his quarters with Lucy, both of them struggling with an impossible choice. David had formed a genuine bond with Tempest, but using that connection to turn the Dragon into an instrument of mass destruction felt like the ultimate betrayal of everything they'd accomplished. "What would Mom do?" Lucy asked quietly. She always asked this question when they faced difficult decisions, seeking guidance from Sarah's memory of right and wrong. David smiled sadly. "She'd tell me that being able to do something doesn't mean you should do it, and that protecting innocent people matters more than following orders, even if it gets us in trouble, especially then." The next morning brought frantic preparations as the 3rd Battle Group assembled for deployment. Tempest would travel aboard the flagship Indomitable, housed in a specialized combat bay designed for Dragon operations. David accompanied the Dragon as its bonded trainer, officially part of the mission, whether he liked it or not. The journey to Meridian 7 took 5 days, during which David spent every possible moment with Tempest. The Dragon sensed his distress, responding with the comforting presence David had come to treasure. They'd formed something unprecedented, a partnership based on mutual respect rather than dominance. As the fleet approached the target system, Admiral Stone summoned David to the bridge for final mission briefings. The tactical display showed Meridian 7's major population centers marked alongside military targets. The plan called for Tempest to lead the assault, using her devastating breath weapon to destroy rebel defenses, while Imperial ground forces secured strategic locations. "Your Dragon will eliminate these installations," Stone explained, highlighting civilian infrastructure that rebels were using for military purposes. Power plants, communication hubs, transportation networks. Standard terror doctrine. David studied the targeting information with growing horror. The power plants supplied energy to hospitals and schools. The communication networks carried civilian emergency services. Destroying these targets would cause massive civilian casualties without significantly impacting actual military capabilities. "Admiral," David said carefully, "these targets will cause extensive civilian casualties. Tempest could be used more precisely against purely military installations." Stone's expression hardened. "The Dragon follows targeting orders, Sergeant. It's not your place to question Imperial strategy." As final preparations began, David faced the moment he'd been dreading. Tempest looked at him with trusting eyes, ready to follow wherever he led. The Dragon had shared its deepest grief with him, had chosen him as a new partner despite overwhelming trauma. Now he was expected to betray that trust by turning Tempest into a weapon against innocent people. The deployment ceremony took place in the flagship's main hangar, broadcast across Imperial networks as a demonstration of power. Admiral Stone stood before assembled officers and crew, preparing to formally authorize the attack. David stood beside Tempest, who wore ceremonial harness that marked her as an active war dragon. "Citizens of the Empire," Stone announced to the cameras, "today we demonstrate the cost of defying Imperial authority. Let all who would challenge our rule witness the power of our dragons." This was the moment. David could follow orders, guide Tempest against the targets, and watch innocent people die. Or he could make a choice that would change everything. David stepped forward, moving away from his assigned position. "Admiral, I respectfully decline to participate in attacks against civilian targets." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the hangar stared at David as if he'd declared his intention to fly to the nearest star. Nobody refused direct orders during formal deployment ceremonies, especially not with cameras recording everything. "Sergeant Miller," Stone said dangerously, "you will comply with lawful orders or face court-martial for treason." David looked at the faces around him. Young officers, veteran soldiers, crew members who'd followed orders their entire careers without question. Then he looked at Tempest, whose intelligent eyes held complete trust in his decisions. "My daughter is watching this broadcast," David said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Someday she'll ask me what I did during this war. I want to tell her I protected people instead of terrorizing them." Admiral Stone's face turned red with fury. "Guards, arrest this man for mutiny." As Imperial Marines moved toward David, Tempest reacted with protective instincts that had been building for weeks. The dragon didn't attack. David's influence had taught her restraint, but she positioned herself between the Marines and her partner with unmistakable intent. "Stand down that creature, or we'll destroy it," Stone commanded. David felt the weight of the moment, aware that billions across the Empire were watching this confrontation. His next words would either doom them both or create something unprecedented. "Tempest doesn't take orders from you, Admiral," David said clearly. "She's not a weapon to be aimed at innocent people. She's a partner who chooses who she fights for and who she protects." The dragon's bioluminescent patterns blazed with colors David had never seen, complex emotions playing across her scales as she sensed the importance of this moment. For the first time in Imperial history, a war dragon was choosing its own path instead of following human commands. "This is treason," Stone snarled. But David noticed the Admiral wasn't ordering his Marines forward. Nobody wanted to test their weapons against an angry dragon in close quarters. "No," David replied calmly. "This is what happens when you treat intelligent beings as partners instead of slaves. Tempest isn't rebelling against the Empire. She's choosing to protect innocents instead of terrorizing them." Throughout the fleet on worlds across the Empire, billions of viewers watched a former sergeant stand up to Imperial authority, while a dragon chose compassion over conquest. David had no idea that this moment would spark questions about power, loyalty, and the treatment of all intelligent species within the Empire. All he knew was that he'd kept faith with both his daughter and his dragon partner, and that whatever came next, he could live with the choice he'd made. The aftermath of David's public defiance spread through the Empire like ripples in a pond. Within hours of the broadcast, civilian populations on a dozen worlds were discussing the sergeant who'd stood up to Imperial authority and the dragon who'd chosen protection over destruction. Military commanders found themselves fielding uncomfortable questions from their own troops about the nature of loyalty and the treatment of intelligent beings. Emperor Valix arrived aboard the Indomitable 12 hours after the confrontation, his personal fleet emerging from hyperspace in a display of power that left no doubt about his mood. David waited in the ship's detention area, not in chains but under heavy guard, while Tempest occupied a nearby cargo bay. The dragon had refused to be separated from her partner, and nobody was brave enough to force the issue. "Bring him to the Admiral's quarters," the Emperor commanded upon boarding, "and ensure the dragon can observe our conversation. I want no misunderstandings about what happens to those who defy Imperial authority." David entered the Admiral's quarters to find Emperor Valix standing before the wide viewport, his silhouette dark against the stars. The ruler of the Empire looked older than his public images suggested, wearing the weight of governing hundreds of worlds with visible weariness. "Do you understand what you've done, Sergeant Miller?" Valix asked without turning around. You've made me appear weak before the entire Empire. My enemies will see this as proof that Imperial authority can be challenged with impunity. With respect, Your Majesty, David replied. I challenged a plan to murder civilians, not Imperial authority itself. Valix turned to face him, eyes burning with controlled fury. Those colonists chose rebellion. They accepted the consequences when they supported insurgent activities. Did the children choose rebellion? Did the hospital patients? Did the families trying to live peaceful lives while politicians made decisions they couldn't control? For a moment, the Emperor's mask slipped, revealing something David hadn't expected to see: doubt. Valix had ruled through strength and fear for decades, but David's questions touched on concerns the Emperor rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. You're a father, Valix said suddenly. Your daughter was watching the broadcast. Tell me, Sergeant, what would you do to protect her? The question felt like a trap, but David answered honestly. Anything necessary, Your Majesty. But I'd try to make sure she could be proud of my methods. Pride, Valix repeated, tasting the word like something foreign. An interesting concept from someone facing execution for treason. Through the viewport, they could see Tempest in her temporary housing, the dragon's golden eyes fixed on their location. Her bioluminescent patterns showed the stress colors David had learned to recognize. Worry for her partner's safety, overwhelming her usual calm. Your creature seems genuinely concerned for your welfare, Valix observed. My advisors tell me this emotional attachment is unprecedented in dragon behavior. Tempest isn't my creature, David corrected gently. She's my partner. There's a difference. Explain this difference to me. David chose his words carefully, aware that his answer might determine both their fates. A creature obeys because it has no choice. A partner chooses to cooperate because they trust you and believe in shared goals. Tempest could have killed me any time during our bonding process, but she chose to trust instead. Emperor Valix moved closer to the viewport, studying the massive dragon with new interest. And this trust, it makes her more effective in combat? It makes her more effective at everything. But more importantly, it makes her happy. Tempest was grieving when I arrived, traumatized by loss and forced interactions with trainers who saw her only as a weapon. Now she's healed, purposeful, content with her existence. Content weapons don't serve the Empire's interests, Valix said sharply. Happy partners serve them better than traumatized slaves, David countered. Tempest followed me willingly for weeks, trusted me with her deepest memories, chose to protect me against Imperial Marines. That kind of loyalty can't be forced, it has to be earned. The Emperor was quiet for long minutes, processing ideas that challenged everything he'd built his reign upon. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. How did you know? How did you succeed where our greatest experts failed? David thought of Lucy, of the lessons they'd learned together while processing their shared grief. I listened to what she needed instead of demanding what I wanted. I treated her trauma as something to heal rather than overcome. I respected her intelligence and emotional capacity instead of dismissing them as inconvenient complications. These are not qualities we associate with strength, Valix said slowly. They're the only qualities that create genuine strength, David replied. Force creates obedience that lasts only until something stronger comes along. Trust creates partnerships that endure because both sides choose to maintain them. Through the bulkhead, they heard Tempest's distressed vocalizations as her worry for David intensified. The dragon's emotional state was affecting the entire ship, her cries echoing through the corridors like the voice of some ancient god expressing displeasure. She's afraid you're going to execute me, David said quietly. If you do, she'll never trust another human trainer. All the progress we've made will be lost. Emperor Valix stared at the dragon for another long moment, then made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Admiral Stone's targeting orders are rescinded, he announced. Military objectives only, no civilian infrastructure. If the dragon can be precise in her attacks, we'll use precision rather than terror. The relief David felt was overwhelming, but he kept his expression neutral. Thank you, Your Majesty. Tempest will be far more effective when she's working toward goals she believes in. Over the following days, David and Tempest participated in a series of surgical strikes against purely military targets on Meridian 7. The dragon's precision was remarkable. Guided by partnership rather than coercion, she could distinguish between legitimate military installations and civilian structures with accuracy that impressed even skeptical Imperial commanders. The rebellion on Meridian 7 collapsed within a week, but not because of terror bombing. The rebels surrendered when they realized the Empire had developed the capability for precise discriminating force application. Civilian casualties were minimal, and the population's response to Imperial victory was cooperation rather than resentment. Remarkable, Emperor Valix admitted during the post-mission briefing. Traditional terror doctrine would have required months of occupation forces and constant suppression of insurgent activity. This approach has actually created stability. But the real changes began when they returned to the Dragon Core facility. David's success with Tempest had created a template that other trainers wanted to study and replicate. More importantly, it had raised fundamental questions about the treatment of all intelligent beings within the Empire. Lucy joined David in the facility's new family quarters, her education now including practical experience with interspecies psychology and xenobiology. She spent hours with Tempest, developing her own friendship with the dragon while helping her father document their innovative training methods. The Emperor wants to establish new protocols based on what we've learned, David told Lucy one evening as they watched Tempest practice aerial maneuvers outside their viewing window. Partnership-based training for all Dragon Core units. Will it work with other dragons? Lucy asked. They didn't go through what Tempest experienced. David smiled, watching the magnificent creature who'd taught him as much as he'd taught her. It'll work better. Dragons that haven't been traumatized will be even more receptive to partnership approaches. Tempest was the hardest case possible. If we could reach her, we can reach any of them. The final scene took place 6 months later in the facility's new training center. Designed around principles of cooperation rather than domination, young Imperial cadets from dozens of species watched as David demonstrated partnership bonding with dragons who responded to respect and understanding rather than force. Emperor Valix observed from the administrative gallery, no longer the absolute ruler who'd once demanded unquestioning obedience. David's example had started conversations throughout the Empire about the nature of power, the value of intelligent beings, and the possibility that strength could come from partnership rather than domination. Your Majesty, one of his advisors said quietly, the Senate is asking questions about extending these principles beyond dragon training. Some are suggesting that all intelligent species deserve consideration as partners rather than subjects. Valix watched David work with a young dragon, seeing joy and enthusiasm in the creature's responses that he'd never observed under traditional training methods. Perhaps, the Emperor said thoughtfully, it's time to consider whether true strength comes from ruling others or earning their cooperation. Below them, Tempest soared through the artificial sky of the training center, her bioluminescent patterns blazing with colors that spoke of contentment and purpose. She was no longer the Emperor's dragon. She was David's partner, Lucy's friend, and a symbol of what became possible when intelligence was met with respect rather than domination. The Empire would never be the same, and for the first time in centuries that felt like progress rather than loss.